Dinner looked the same as it always did. Chicken on white plates, steam rising from the rice bowl, the soft yellow light above the table. Conversation moved quickly. My husband telling a story, my son interrupting halfway through, my daughter asking another question. I lifted my fork. My fingers rested against the edge of the plate. I had something to say, but the moment passed before I could find it. I picked up my fork again, took a bite. The chicken was still warm. The room sounded exactly the same, but something inside me had shifted slightly. Not disappointment, not exactly. More like the fading of something that had always been there. Now I wasn't sure when it had begun to disappear. The television in the living room grew louder for a moment. Someone scored. The announcer raised his voice. My husband glanced toward the doorway. "Game must be close," he said. My son nodded. My daughter reached for her drink. The table returned to its usual rhythm: forks, plates, small pieces of conversation. I rested my hand on the edge of the table. The wood felt smooth beneath my fingers. For a few seconds, I watched the salt shaker again. My thumb traced the rim of the table slowly, the small glass container sitting quietly in the center, waiting for the next hand to reach for it, waiting for the next moment in the conversation. Then my daughter stood up. "I'm finished." She carried her plate to the sink. My son followed a minute later. My husband pushed his chair back slightly. The table slowly emptied. The salt shaker stayed exactly where it was, right in the center, exactly where it always sat. I sat there for another moment after everyone stood. The room still sounded the same. The television in the living room, the refrigerator humming softly, the quiet movement of someone opening a cabinet. Nothing in the house had changed. Not the light, not the table, not the rhythm of the evening. Only something small inside me had grown a little quieter, for longer than you remember. And the conversation has already moved on. The next morning began the way mornings usually do. Before the sun fully reached the kitchen window, before the street outside started filling with cars. The coffee maker was the first sound, a low mechanical hum. Then the soft drip of coffee filling the glass pot. I stood at the counter, waiting for the last drops to fall. The kitchen light cast a pale circle over the counter. The rest of the house still quiet. For a few seconds, the house belonged only to small sounds. Coffee dripping, the refrigerator humming, the clock above the stove ticking forward. I reached for my mug, the same one I had used for years. White ceramic, a faint crack along one side. So thin, you could only see it when the light hit the surface just right. I knew exactly where to place my lip, so the edge felt smooth. The first sip of coffee was always the same. Warm, quiet, predictable. For a moment, the kitchen felt steady, the kind of quiet that used to exist before the rest of the house woke up. Then footsteps sounded in the hallway. My husband entered first. Still half asleep, phone already in his hand. He leaned against the counter, scrolling through something, the screen lighting his face faintly. "Morning," he said. "Morning." His voice sounded soft, automatic, like the word had been spoken every morning for years, which it probably had. He poured himself coffee, stood beside the sink, checked his phone again. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to turn pale. A car passed slowly on the street. Then the hallway light clicked on again. My daughter appeared in the doorway, hair still messy. She opened the pantry without speaking. The cereal box rustled. Milk splashed lightly into the bowl. My son followed a minute later, backpack already on his shoulder. He opened the refrigerator, grabbed orange juice. The kitchen filled with quiet movement. Cabinet doors, spoons against ceramic bowls, the scrape of a chair. No one said much. Mornings used to sound different. Years ago, there had been more questions, more interruptions. Someone always looking for something. A missing shoe, a forgotten permission slip. Back then, the kitchen had been louder, more chaotic. Now, everything moved smoothly. Each person knew where to stand, where to reach, what to grab before leaving. The routine had become almost invisible. My husband finished his coffee first. He rinsed the mug in the sink. The water ran for a moment, then stopped. "I've got an early meeting today," he said. "Okay." He picked up his keys from the counter. The small metal ring made a light sound as it brushed against the granite. My daughter checked the clock. "We're going to miss the bus." My son grabbed his backpack strap. The front door opened. Cold morning air slipped into the hallway. Then the door closed again. Their footsteps faded down the driveway. The house grew quiet once more. My husband looked at the clock. "I should go too." He placed his empty mug in the sink. For a moment, he stood beside me, not speaking, just looking toward the window. Then he picked up his jacket. "I'll see you tonight." "Okay." The front door opened again, closed again, and just like that, the kitchen returned to stillness. The coffee maker had stopped humming. The refrigerator motor clicked softly before settling into its steady rhythm. Sunlight finally reached the edge of the counter. I stood there holding my mug. The coffee had cooled slightly. For a moment, I didn't move. The kitchen looked exactly the same as it always had. Same counter, same cabinets, same light falling across the table. But something about the morning felt different. Not wrong, just lighter. Like a conversation that had once existed had slowly grown shorter. I walked to the sink, rinsed my mug, set it beside the others. The house remained quiet, the hallway empty, the chairs pushed slightly away from the table. For years, mornings had moved around me. Questions, reminders, small interruptions. Now the routine moved smoothly without needing those pauses. The house had learned its rhythm, and that rhythm no longer waited for anyone to slow it down, not even me. I rested my hand briefly on the edge of the kitchen table. The wood felt cool. In the center of the table, the salt shaker still sat where it had been the night before. A small glass container, completely ordinary, waiting for the next meal, the next conversation. The next moment, someone reached for it. I left it there, exactly where it belonged, and stepped into the quiet hallway as the morning continued the way mornings always did. The afternoon bell always rang a little louder than it needed to. Maybe it was just the echo in the hallway. Or maybe the sound carried farther because everyone was already thinking about leaving. From my office, I could hear lockers closing, backpacks sliding off hooks, shoes moving quickly across the floor. The school building had its own rhythm too, different from the house, but familiar in the same way. By 3 o'clock, the hallways began to empty. Teachers stepped into their classrooms. Students drifted toward the exits, and slowly the building settled into a quieter version of itself. I finished the last notes from a meeting, closed the folder, turned off the small lamp on my desk. Outside the office window, the parking lot had already begun filling with cars, parents waiting along the curb, engines idling, windshields reflecting the afternoon light. I walked out through the front doors. The air outside felt cooler than the hallway. The late afternoon sun sat low above the football field. I crossed the parking lot slowly. My car was parked near the far row, a place that usually stayed open even when the lot filled quickly. Inside the car, the quiet felt different, the kind that comes after a long day of voices. I placed my bag in the passenger seat, started the engine. The dashboard lights glowed softly. The radio turned on automatically to the same station it always found, a quiet voice reading the local news. I lowered the volume. Students began pouring out of the main doors, groups of teenagers moving together, laughing, talking over each other, the same way they had for years. I leaned back slightly in the seat, watching the sidewalk, waiting. A few minutes later, I saw my son, backpack hanging low over one shoulder, walking beside two boys from his soccer team. One of them said something. They all laughed. The sound carried across the lot. He reached the car, opened the passenger door, dropped into the seat, his phone already in his hand. "Hey," I said. "Hey." The word came out quietly, half his attention still on the screen. He pulled the seatbelt across his chest. The buckle clicked. I waited a moment before putting the car in reverse. "How was school?" "Fine." The answer came automatically, almost before the question finished. I pulled slowly out of the parking space. Cars lined both sides of the lane, parents waving through windshields, students crossing between vehicles. "What'd you do in history today?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. "Nothing much." His thumb moved across the phone screen. A faint sound from his headphones leaked into the car, music I didn't recognize. We reached the stop sign at the exit. A line of cars stretched toward the street, the same routine every afternoon. Wait, creep forward, wait again. When he was younger, these rides home had sounded different. Stories filled the space between intersections, details about classmates, teachers, games played at recess. Sometimes the stories didn't make much sense, but they filled the car with energy. Now the car felt quieter, not uncomfortable, just different. The kind of quiet that comes when someone grows used to carrying their own thoughts. We reached the main road. The grocery store sign flashed green across the intersection. A delivery truck passed in the opposite lane. My son adjusted one headphone. "Practice tomorrow?" I asked. "Yeah." "What time?" 4. The conversation paused again. Not awkward, just short. I stopped at the red light. The late afternoon sun spread across the dashboard. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The music from his headphones blended softly with the sound of traffic outside. The light turned green. I pressed the gas gently. We drove the rest of the way home in the quiet rhythm that had become normal. When we turned onto our street, he glanced briefly out the window, then back to his phone. The driveway appeared ahead. I pulled in. The engine idled for a second. He unbuckled his seatbelt. "Dinner at 6?" I said. "Yeah." He stepped out of the car. The door closed. His footsteps moved quickly toward the house. The front door opened, closed again. The driveway returned to stillness. For a moment, I sat there with the engine still running, the steering wheel warm beneath my hands. The same afternoon routine I had followed for years. Pick up, short conversation, drive home. None of it felt unusual. The rhythm worked. It always had. Still, something about the quiet inside the car lingered. Not emptiness, not distance, just the absence of something that had once filled these small spaces. Questions, stories, long explanations about things that mattered deeply to a 12-year-old. Now, most conversations happened between destinations, between schedules, short, efficient. The engine hummed softly beneath me. I turned the key. The dashboard lights faded. The radio went silent. Outside, the late afternoon wind moved lightly through the trees. I picked up my bag from the passenger seat, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the house as the day moved forward, the way afternoons always do. Dinner came together the way it usually did, the kitchen filling slowly with small sounds, cabinet doors opening, the refrigerator closing, water running briefly in the sink. By the time everyone gathered around the table, the sky outside had already begun to darken. The overhead light cast a warm circle over the table. 4 plates, 4 chairs. Steam rising from the bowl in the center. My daughter reached for her glass first. My son sat down heavily in his chair. My husband pulled his seat back slightly before settling in. For a moment, the room paused. The kind of quiet that happens right before conversation begins. Then my daughter started talking. Something about a presentation in her English class. She spoke quickly, words moving faster than the forks. My husband nodded, asked a question halfway through. My son interrupted with something about practice. The table filled with voices, normal voices, nothing tense, nothing unusual. I took a bite of food, the plate warm beneath my hand. Someone laughed. The conversation moved again, quick, comfortable, familiar. My son reached toward the center of the table. Pass the salt? The small glass shaker sat beside the bowl of rice. My husband picked it up. The metal lid caught the light. He slid it across the table. The glass made a faint sound against the wood surface. My son grabbed it, sprinkled salt over his plate, then pushed it toward my daughter. Here. She took it without looking up, added a little to her food. The shaker moved again, from one hand to another, back toward the center. It paused briefly near my plate, close enough that I could see the tiny grains gathered against the glass. I rested my fingers on the edge of the table. My daughter reached past my hand and took the shaker again. Thanks. She passed it toward my husband. Conversation continued. My husband began telling a story about work, something about a new manager. My son laughed before the story ended. My daughter added something about a teacher. The voices overlapped. The rhythm of the table moving easily. No one paused. No one waited. I looked down at my plate, the food still warm, the fork resting beside it. Across from me, my husband leaned forward slightly as he talked. My son nodded along. My daughter asked another question. The salt shaker returned to the center of the table, exactly where it had been before. A small glass container resting quietly between the plates, waiting for the next hand, for the next pause. But the pause never came. The conversation flowed forward without stopping. I lifted my glass, took a small drink. The water felt cool. My husband reached for the bread. My daughter asked about the weekend. My son mentioned a game on Saturday. The rhythm of the table felt smooth, practiced, like a conversation that had repeated itself for years. And suddenly, I noticed something small. No one at the table was waiting, not for silence, not for a response, not even for the next voice. The conversation moved on its own, like a current, carrying each person forward. My daughter finished first. "I'm done." She stood up, carried her plate toward the sink. My son followed a minute later. My husband leaned back slightly in his chair. The table slowly emptied. I remained seated, my plate still half full. The salt shaker sat quietly in the center, exactly where it always rested. The overhead light reflected faintly through the glass. For a few seconds, I watched it. Then I finished the last bite on my plate, pushed the chair back. The legs scraped softly against the floor. The kitchen behind me filled with the sound of running water, plates touching porcelain, cabinet doors closing. Nothing in the room had changed. The same table, the same chairs, the same quiet rhythm the house had always carried. And yet something small inside me had shifted again. Expectation had once lived in these pauses, in the small moments between sentences. Now, those pauses seemed to belong to the room itself, not to anyone sitting in it. I stood up slowly, carried my plate to the sink. The water ran warm over the dish. Behind me, the salt shaker remained on the table, resting exactly in the center, waiting for the next dinner, the next conversation, the next evening that would sound almost exactly like this one. Saturday mornings usually began a little slower. No alarm, no rush toward the front door. The house woke gradually, sunlight reaching the kitchen counter first, then the hallway, then the living room. I left a little after 9. The grocery store was only 10 minutes away, the same one we had been using for years. The parking lot was already half full. Shopping carts lined the entrance, metal wheels clicking softly when someone pushed one free. I grabbed a cart from the row, the handle cold in my hands. The doors slid open. Cool air and bright fluorescent light filled the space. Inside the store, everything looked exactly the same as always. Rows of shelves, wide aisles, quiet music playing somewhere above the ceiling. The wheels of the cart rolled slowly across the tile, a faint rhythmic sound. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the grocery list. Most of the items belonged to someone else. My husband's yogurt, my daughter's cereal, my son's frozen pizza, bread, milk, pasta. The list had grown familiar over the years, almost automatic. I turned down the first aisle. Boxes of cereal stacked in neat rows, bright colors, familiar logos. My daughter liked the same brand she had eaten since elementary school. I placed the box into the cart. The cardboard made a soft, hollow sound against the metal. Next aisle, yogurt. The refrigerator doors fogged slightly when I opened one. Cold air brushed against my hand. I grabbed the same brand my husband always bought. Strawberry. 2 containers. The cart moved forward again, its wheels turning slowly. Further into the store, the produce section opened into a wide green space. Rows of apples, stacks of oranges. A thin mist spraying lightly over the lettuce. I paused near the tomatoes. The grocery list on my phone still glowing faintly. For a moment, I stared at it, scrolling down slowly. Each item connected to someone else in the house, someone else's habit, someone else's preference. I reached for a bag of apples, placed it carefully into the cart. The plastic crinkled softly. A woman pushed her cart past me, a small child sitting in the front seat. The child pointed toward a display of bananas. "Those ones," the woman smiled. "Okay." They moved down the aisle together, I watched them for a moment, then looked back at my phone. There was space at the bottom of the list, an empty line, waiting for something else. I stood there trying to remember if there was anything I wanted, something specific, something that belonged only to me. The thought stayed there for a few seconds, then drifted away. The store moved around me, carts rolling, voices passing quietly between shelves, a worker stacking boxes near the dairy section. I added another item to the cart. Milk, bread, eggs. The list slowly disappeared, item by item, until the cart held everything the house expected, everything the week would require. I pushed the cart toward the checkout lanes, the wheels clicking softly over the seams in the floor. The cashier scanned each item. The scanner beeped steadily, a small rhythm of its own. When she finished, she slid the receipt across the counter. The paper curled slightly in the air. Outside, the parking lot felt warmer now, the sun higher. I loaded the grocery bags into the trunk, plastic rustling lightly. The trunk closed with a quiet thud. For a moment, I stood beside the car, the same store sign blinking near the road, the same row of carts near the entrance. Nothing about the morning felt unusual, just another trip, another list completed, another routine moving forward. I opened the driver's door, sat inside the car, the steering wheel warm beneath my hands, the grocery bags resting quietly in the trunk, the receipt folded once and placed into the cup holder. For a moment, I didn't start the engine. The parking lot stretched out in front of me, cars coming and going, people pushing carts toward the entrance, the same small rhythm repeating again and again. Eventually, I turned the key. The engine started. The radio came on softly. I pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward home with the same groceries the house had been expecting all week. Evenings usually settled into the living room. Not immediately. First, the kitchen quieted. Dishes stacked near the sink. Leftovers placed into containers. The refrigerator door opening and closing. Then, gradually, everyone drifted toward the couch. The television turned on before anyone spoke, a blue glow filling the wall. That night, a game was already halfway through, the commentator's voice steady, the occasional cheer from the crowd. My husband sat first, the remote already in his hand. He leaned back into the corner of the couch, the way he always did. My son dropped into the other end, one leg stretched out, phone still in his hand. My daughter took the chair beside the coffee table, scrolling through something quietly. I sat down last. The couch cushion dipped slightly beneath me. A folded blanket rested between my husband and me, not dividing the couch. Just lying there, like it had been earlier in the week. I leaned back. The television light flickered softly across the room. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The game moved forward, players running across the screen, the crowd rising and falling in waves of sound. My husband nodded at something the commentator said. "Good play." My son glanced up briefly. "Yeah." Then his eyes returned to the phone. The room settled again, quiet, comfortable. The kind of quiet that doesn't require explanation. I folded my hands together in my lap. The fabric of the couch felt soft beneath my fingers. For a moment, I watched the television without really following the game. The blue light shifted across the ceiling. The announcer's voice rose again. A replay filled the screen. My husband leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. The blanket between us slipped a little closer to his side. I noticed the small space between our shoulders. Not wide, not uncomfortable. Just there. A small distance that had probably existed for years. But tonight I noticed it. The game paused for a commercial break, the screen filled with bright colors. My daughter stood up. "I'm getting water." She walked into the kitchen. The refrigerator door opened, closed again. My son stretched his legs. The phone light reflected faintly across his face. My husband reached for the remote, lowered the volume. For a moment, the room felt almost silent. The television still moving, but quieter now. From the kitchen, I heard the faint click of a cabinet door. Then another sound. Soft, steady. The dishwasher beginning its cycle. Water moving through the pipes. The low mechanical hum filling the background. It blended with the television sound, with the quiet movements in the room. I rested my head against the back of the couch, the cushion cool against my neck. Across the room, my daughter returned with a glass of water. She sat back down in the chair. The game resumed. The commentator raised his voice again. My husband leaned back into the couch. The blanket remained between us. Not touched, just resting there. I looked at the edge of the coffee table, a small stack of mail, 2 magazines, the remote resting near my husband's hand. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. And yet something about the quiet felt slightly different. Not heavier, not colder, just a little clearer, like noticing a sound in a room that had always been there. The dishwasher continued humming in the kitchen. The television flickered against the wall. My husband watched the game. My son watched his phone. My daughter sipped her water slowly. And I sat there beside them, feeling the soft space on the couch where the blanket rested between us. The hallway light was already on when I stepped away from the living room. No one noticed. Not because they were ignoring me, just because the game had reached a louder moment. The commentator's voice rose again behind me. A cheer from the crowd followed. The living room doorframe held the sound there as I moved toward the kitchen. The hallway was dimmer. Only the small ceiling light above the stairs, soft yellow. The kind of light that makes the walls look warmer than they really are. My footsteps slowed near the kitchen doorway. I hadn't meant to stop. I had only come for a glass of water. But something about the sound of voices made me pause there. From the doorway, I could see the dining table. Empty now. 4 chairs slightly pushed away. Plates already rinsed and stacked near the sink. The salt shaker still sat in the center, exactly where it had been earlier. A small glass shape beneath the overhead light. Beyond the kitchen, the living room remained bright with television light. My husband was still watching the game, leaning forward again. My son had moved slightly across the couch, phone in one hand, eyes shifting between the screen and the television. My daughter laughed at something on her phone. The sound traveled through the hallway, then faded again. For a moment, I stood there in the doorway, not moving, just watching the room. It looked the same as it always did. The same arrangement of furniture, the same small table beside the couch, the same lamp in the corner. The house had carried this rhythm for years. Dinner, then the living room, then quiet. The pattern rarely changed. I reached for a glass from the cabinet. The door opened with a soft click. Water ran into the glass from the sink. The faucet sounded louder in the quiet kitchen. When I turned it off, the dishwasher hum returned. Steady, even, like a distant engine. I leaned lightly against the counter, the cool surface beneath my palm. From the living room, I could hear my husband speaking. Something about a replay. My son answered with a short comment. Then, the commentator's voice filled the space again. The game continued. The house continued. Everyone moving easily within the routine. I lifted the glass of water, took a small sip. The kitchen felt still. Behind me, the hallway stretched toward the bedrooms. Ahead of me, the living room light flickered. For a moment, I realized something quietly. The house didn't slow when someone left a room. It didn't pause. The rhythm simply continued. Conversation flowed around empty spaces, like water moving past a rock in a stream. No resistance, no interruption, just movement. I set the glass down on the counter, looked once more toward the living room. My husband laughed at something on the screen. My son leaned forward slightly. My daughter shifted in the chair. None of them had noticed how long I had been standing in the hallway. Not because they were ignoring me, just because the house had learned how to move forward on its own. I stood there for another moment, then turned off the kitchen light. The room dimmed, the dishwasher still humming softly in the dark, and the living room glow remained steady as the evening continued exactly the way evenings always had. The next evening arrived quietly, not different from the one before. The same kitchen light above the table, the same 4 plates set in their places. Outside the window, the sky had already turned the pale gray of early evening. Dinner came together the way it usually did. My daughter carried the bowls to the table. My son opened the refrigerator and grabbed a drink. My husband rinsed his hands at the sink. The faucet ran for a few seconds, then stopped. Chairs slid softly against the floor as everyone sat down. For a moment, the room paused again, just long enough for the quiet to settle between us. Then conversation began. My daughter started first. Something about a teacher assigning extra reading. My husband asked a question. My son added something about practice. The voices overlapped. Forks touched plates. The rhythm of the table returned. The same steady movement it always carried. I listened, nodded once or twice, took a few bites from my plate. Nothing about the dinner felt unusual. It sounded like every other evening. Comfortable, predictable. The kind of conversation that doesn't require effort. My son leaned forward. "Can you pass the salt?" The small glass shaker sat near the center of the table again. My husband picked it up. The metal lid caught the light briefly. He slid it across the table. My son caught it, shook a small line of salt across his food, then passed it toward my daughter. She reached for it without looking up. "Thanks." The shaker moved again, across the table, between hands, back toward the center. For a moment, it rested beside my plate, closer this time, the glass reflecting the overhead light. My fingers rested on the table a few inches away from it. No one asked if I wanted it. No one noticed it there. Conversation continued. My husband mentioned something about the weekend. My daughter laughed at something my son said. The rhythm of voices moved quickly, just like the night before. I looked down at the shaker, the tiny grains of salt pressed lightly against the glass. For a moment, no one reached for it. It stayed there beside my plate, quiet, unnoticed. I wrapped my fingers around it. The glass felt cool in my hand, the metal lid smooth against my thumb. I didn't add salt to my food. I simply held the shaker there, listening. My daughter was describing a friend from school. My husband nodded along. My son interrupted with another comment. The conversation shifted again, one topic blending into the next. No pause, no break in the rhythm. After a moment, I placed the shaker back down. Not in the center this time, just beside my plate, where it had been. The dinner continued. My daughter finished first again. She stood up, carried her plate toward the sink. My son leaned back in his chair. Practice tomorrow is going to be rough. My husband smiled. You'll be fine. Their conversation moved toward something else. The table slowly emptied again, chairs pushing back, footsteps moving across the kitchen floor. Soon, it was only the sound of water running in the sink, plates touching softly together. I remained seated for another moment, the salt shaker still beside my plate, the overhead light reflecting faintly across the glass. I touched it once more with my fingertips, then slid it gently back to the center of the table, exactly where it belonged. The same place it had always sat, waiting quietly for the next dinner, the next conversation, the next evening when someone would reach for it again without thinking. Later that night, the house settled slowly. The living room lights dimmed first, then the television. My husband turned it off with the remote. The screen went dark. My son disappeared down the hallway toward his room. My daughter followed a few minutes later. Doors closing softly, the sounds of the house grew smaller. Footsteps, running water in the bathroom, a cabinet closing somewhere down the hall. Then, quiet again. I remained in the kitchen. The dishwasher had already started its cycle. Water moving steadily through the pipes, a low hum filling the room. I wiped the counter with a dish towel, the same small motions I had done thousands of times. The kitchen looked clean, orderly. The table still standing in the center of the room. 4 chairs pushed neatly beneath it, the salt shaker resting in its place. For a moment, I leaned against the counter, the dish towel still in my hand. The house felt calm, almost too calm. Years earlier, evenings had sounded different. The kitchen had rarely been this quiet. Someone always needed something. A missing homework assignment, a glass of water, a story from school that had to be told immediately. Back then, the house felt louder, busier, every room filled with motion. Dinner conversations stretched longer, questions overlapping, small arguments about homework or bedtime. Sometimes, I had barely finished eating before someone called from another room. Those years moved quickly, one moment blending into the next, and somehow the house had slowly changed. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a gradual shift. Children growing older, schedules becoming more organized, everyone learning their routines. Now evenings moved smoothly. Dinner, then the living room, then quiet. The dishwasher continued its steady rhythm, water moving behind the metal door. I walked over to the table, rested my hand lightly on the back of a chair. The wood felt cool beneath my fingers. For a moment, I looked at the salt shaker again. The same small glass container, exactly where it had been earlier, exactly where it would be tomorrow night. I remembered how many dinners that table had seen. Birthday cakes, homework spread across the surface, board games that lasted too long, late-night conversations after the kids had gone to bed. The table had been the center of everything, a place where voices gathered, where stories paused long enough for someone else to speak. Now the table still held dinners, still held conversations, but the rhythm had changed. Faster, smoother, less interruption. The pauses had grown shorter, and somewhere along the way, the expectation of those pauses had faded. I pulled out a chair slowly. The legs scraped softly across the floor. Sat down for a moment. The kitchen light cast a quiet circle across the table. The dishwasher hummed behind me. The rest of the house remained still. Not empty, just resting. I placed both hands on the table, felt the smooth wood beneath my palms. Nothing about the room felt unfamiliar. It was the same house, the same table, the same evening routine repeating itself. Only something inside me had begun to understand the rhythm differently. Not as something waiting for me, but as something that simply moved forward. I stood up again, pushed the chair back into place, turned off the kitchen light. The room darkened except for the faint glow from the hallway. The dishwasher continued running in the quiet, and the house settled deeper into the night. The next evening, the house followed the same routine again. Dinner around 6, the kitchen filling with the quiet sounds of plates and chairs. Nothing unusual about the meal. Rice, chicken, a bowl of vegetables in the center of the table. The overhead light casting the same warm circle over everything. My daughter sat down first. My son followed. My husband pulled his chair back slightly before settling into his usual place. For a moment, everyone reached for something. Glasses, forks, napkins, the small movements that begin a meal. Then the conversation started. My daughter talked about a project again. My son interrupted with something about practice. My husband asked a question. The voices blended together just like they had the night before, just like they always did. I listened for a few minutes, took a few bites from my plate. Across the table, the salt shaker rested near the bowl of vegetables. Someone reached for it. My son this time. He added salt quickly, then slid it toward my daughter. She used it without looking up, passed it toward my husband. The small glass container moved across the table again, hand to hand, exactly the same way it had the other nights. For a moment, it rested near my plate, the metal lid catching the light. My fingers rested beside it. But tonight, I didn't reach for it. I simply left it there. Conversation continued. My daughter laughed. My husband leaned forward slightly as he spoke. My son nodded along. The rhythm of voices moved quickly again. No pauses, no waiting. I realized something quietly then. For years, I had moved with that rhythm, standing up to refill glasses, reaching for something someone needed, adjusting small things around the table. Tonight, I stayed seated. The plates remained where they were. The glasses emptied slowly. No one noticed, not because they were ignoring anything, just because the conversation continued easily. My husband finished his food. My daughter leaned back in her chair. My son reached for another piece of bread. The table moved forward without needing anyone to guide it. For a moment, I watched the salt shaker again, still resting near my plate, exactly where it had been placed, unnoticed. I wrapped my fingers around it, not to use it, just to move it gently back toward the center. The glass slid softly across the table, then stopped. Conversation continued around it, just like before. My daughter stood up first again. "I've got homework." She carried her plate toward the sink. My son followed a minute later. My husband remained for a moment, finishing the last bite of food. Then he pushed his chair back, The table slowly emptied, just like every other night. For a moment, I stayed seated, the chair slightly pulled away from the table, the overhead light reflecting softly off the glass salt shaker in the center. Nothing about the room had changed. The same table, the same chairs, the same quiet rhythm moving through the house. Only this time, I had moved differently within it. I had simply stayed where I was, and the house had continued forward exactly the same way. The kitchen was quiet again later that night, the kind of quiet that settles slowly. First the television turned off, then the hallway lights, doors closing one by one down the hall. My husband went to bed earlier than usual, something about an early meeting. My son's room light glowed under the door for a while. Then that light disappeared too. My daughter's music stopped not long after. Eventually, the house reached the same quiet place it always did near the end of the night. Only the kitchen light remained, soft and steady above the table. I stood at the sink, rinsing the last plate. Warm water running over the surface, the dish rack already half full. The faucet turned off with a small twist of the handle. And then the dishwasher started, the low mechanical hum returning again, a sound that always seemed louder once the rest of the house went silent. I dried my hands on the towel, folded it once, placed it beside the sink. For a moment, I simply stood there. The kitchen looked exactly the same as it had earlier. Clean counters, chairs tucked neatly beneath the table, the small glass salt shaker still resting in the center. The overhead light reflected faintly through the glass. I walked over slowly, pulled one of the chairs out. The legs scraped softly across the floor. I sat down. The wood of the table felt cool beneath my hands. The dishwasher continued humming behind me, a steady sound, almost like breathing. For a few seconds, I looked around the room. The refrigerator stood quietly against the wall, the microwave clock glowing green. The hallway beyond the kitchen dark now. Everything in the house seemed to have found its place for the night. I reached toward the salt shaker, wrapped my fingers around the glass. The small grains inside shifted slightly, a faint sound as they settled. I turned the shaker slowly in my hand, watching the light move across the metal lid. For years, this table had held so many different moments. School projects spread across its surface, birthday candles, late-night conversations that stretched longer than expected. Back then, someone was always asking another question, someone always waiting for an answer. Now the table held dinners that moved more smoothly, conversations that flowed quickly, no one stopping long enough for silence to settle. I placed the salt shaker back on the table, right where it had been, in the center, exactly where everyone expected it to be. For a moment, I rested my hand beside it, the wood beneath my palm cool and steady. The dishwasher continued its slow rhythm, water moving quietly behind the metal door. I leaned back slightly in the chair, listening. The house had carried this same quiet night after night, the same sounds, the same spaces. Nothing about it felt unfamiliar, and yet something about sitting there alone felt clearer now. Not lonely, just quiet. The kind of quiet that lets you hear the smallest sounds in the room. The refrigerator motor starting again, the faint tick of the kitchen clock, the steady hum of the dishwasher. I stood up slowly, pushed the chair back beneath the table. The salt shaker remained exactly where it was, a small glass object waiting for tomorrow evening, waiting for another dinner, another conversation moving easily around it. I turned off the kitchen light. The room fell into darkness. Only the hallway glow faintly touching the edge of the table. The dishwasher continued running in the dark, and the house settled deeper into the night. The dishwasher was still running when I came back into the kitchen. The house had gone quiet a while ago. The kind of quiet that arrives after every door in the hallway has closed, after the last light in the living room turns off, after the last footsteps fade. Only the small sounds remain. The refrigerator humming softly, the dishwasher moving water behind its metal door, the faint tick of the clock above the stove. I stood near the doorway for a moment. The kitchen looked different in the dark. Only the light above the sink was on now, a softer light, enough to see the edges of the table, the chairs, the counter, everything else fading into shadow. I walked slowly toward the table, the floor cool beneath my feet, the same 4 chairs resting around it, the same place where we had sat earlier, where the conversation had moved quickly from one voice to another, where the salt shaker had passed between hands. The small glass container still rested in the center, exactly where I had left it. For a moment, I stood there looking at it. The metal lid reflected a small circle of light. The glass looked almost clear in the dim kitchen. I pulled out a chair. The legs scraped softly against the floor. Then the sound disappeared again. I sat down, both hands resting lightly on the table. The wood felt smooth beneath my palms. The dishwasher hummed steadily behind me, a sound that seemed to fill the entire room. I reached forward, wrapped my fingers around the salt shaker. The glass felt cool. The grains inside shifted slightly when I lifted it, a soft, dry sound. For a few seconds, I turned it slowly in my hand, watching the light move across the metal lid. The same object that had moved across the table earlier passed from one person to another, never stopping long enough for anyone to notice it. I placed the shaker back down, not exactly in the center this time, just a little closer to my side of the table. Then I leaned back in the chair. The kitchen remained still. No voices, no television, only the quiet rhythm of the dishwasher continuing its cycle. The house had already settled into night. Down the hallway, my husband slept. My son's door remained closed. My daughter's room, silent. Everything in the house resting where it belonged. The table looked exactly the same as it always had. The same chairs, the same light, the same small glass shaker waiting quietly. I rested my hand on the table once more, the wood warm now beneath my fingers. The dishwasher continued humming, and somewhere beyond the window, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sliding briefly across the kitchen wall, then disappearing again. For a moment, the room grew completely still. The salt shaker remained where I had placed it, not quite in the center anymore, but close enough that no one would notice.